One mind, one body, one voice, a grand unification bringing together the living and dead, uniting them in paradise. All claimed in the most ironic way by the topic of today's video, the Church of Unitology from Dead Space, whose ideals and claims were proven true, albeit in the worst, most ironic and monkey's paw way possible. But in regards to what the Church of Unitology is, Unitology is a religion officially founded in 2215 on the discoveries of the geophysicist Michael Altman. Unitologists adamantly believing that the human race was created by the intelligent design of a divine alien agency, and would be reunited after death in heaven through the power of a sacred artifact referred to as the Marker. The discovery of the black marker on Earth in the Chicxulub crater in 2214, inspiring the creation of Unitology, albeit the existence of this marker would be covered up by the government, and kept a secret ever since, albeit it was unveiled to the public by Michael Altman shortly before his death. And Unitologists now claim the artifact contains the secrets of human evolution and eternal life. Mere fragments of knowledge recovered from studying the marker form the basis of Unitology's teachings. Death is only the beginning, and with the marker's knowledge all of humanity will ascend to divinity and be reborn as one entity or made whole in an event known as convergence. Which would all turn out to be true on a surface level, but if anyone has played the events of Dead Space, you would know exactly what all this means. For further elaboration on that, especially for those who don't know, death is only the beginning refers to the beginning of a Necromorph outbreak, which necessitates pre-existing dead bodies, which through the influence of the marker initially reanimate to make the first Necromorphs. The iconic slashers of the Dead Space franchise being the first ones it will typically create. Said slashers will then proceed to stack up bodies leading to more Necromorphs. With the marker's knowledge, this in particular is referring to how the marker influences humanity. How people like Isaac Clarke, who are geniuses, will receive instructions on how to create more markers, while the less intelligent will either kill themselves or kill others to serve the marker, adding more bodies towards the Necromorph outbreak and bringing it towards the third point, that being humanity's ascent to divinity and being reborn as one entity or being made whole in the event known as convergence, which in reality is actually everyone being killed by Necromorphs, their bodies being pulled up into the sky and converging into a Brethren Moon. Brethren Moons being the primary antagonist of the Dead Space franchise behind the Necromorph outbreaks, along with the markers and Unitology. And in regards to the Brethren Moons, I have previously done a video on them. It will be linked in the top right corner if you are interested. But anyway, ultimately, death, the marker's knowledge, and the ascension of humanity are all heavily reoccurring themes within Unitology, especially in its doctrines and practices, and many other aspects of the religion, which I will begin to cover, starting with the official history, as to provide historical context on the group. In 2214, a geophysicist named Michael Altman made a discovery that would change history. Buried at the impact site of a crater near the Yucatan Peninsula, he discovered an alien presence, that being the Marker. The Marker supposedly speaking to Altman and revealing a plan that would unify mankind and lead them to a, and I quote, bright new future, end quote. By the millions, people flocked to hear more about the Marker and the unity it promised after Michael Altman told the world of his profound discovery. But there were those who felt threatened by Altman's message. On March 15th, 2215, Altman was, and I quote, assassinated, end quote, and thus became the first martyr of the church. Altman's followers mourned his death, but found divine solace in his message of unity. They would not allow the truth to be silenced, and formed the Church of Unitology to bring his teachings to the world. Today, the Church of Unitology can be found everywhere in the known universe. Its message is just as strong and relevant today as it was when Altman first revealed it. Billions of believers can be found across all social, economic and cultural groups, and more are joining every day as we await glorious convergence. It is important to continue to nurture our relationship with the Marker and understand the future it is preparing for us. The Marker calls to all of us. It is our duty to approach with an open heart and open mind. This official history, in quotations, being the, and I quote, truth perpetuated by the church, when in reality the origins of Unitology are much different. When he first discovered the black marker in the crater, Altman worked with a mining corporation, Dredger Corp, and the military under Craig Markov to recover the artifact and bring it to a floating facility for study. After the studies on the marker began, it was speculated that its signal and technology held tremendous power and could be used as a source of limitless energy. Realizing the power of the marker and with the belief that the government was planning to cover it up entirely, Altman escaped from the Ocean facility and made a public announcement about the marker's existence during a press conference, declaring that the artifact was the first proof of alien life, claiming that it even predated humanity, although he confessed to not knowing exactly what its purpose was. After this announcement, he was apprehended and brought back to the research facility, where he soon bore witness to the beginning of a Necromorph outbreak. Said outbreak ravaged and slaughtered most of the staff, although Altman himself managed to escape the outbreak and the floating facility, which was beginning to sink during the outbreak. He was then captured by Markov as well as Stevens, a psychologist who had been working alongside him. Stevens and Markov revealed themselves to be believers in the marker's ability to create eternal life and in its supposedly benevolent intentions of leading humanity to convergence. As the two men needed a way to get the rest of the world to share this faith, they decided to use Altman's death and apparent martyrdom to found a new religion that would, and I quote, prepare mankind for the coming convergence, end quote. Altman himself ultimately being murdered by Stevens and Markov, both of them then posing as his acolytes, leading to the public founding of the Church of Unitology, in his name despite the government's efforts to cover up the entire disaster. After Altman's death, Stephen and Markov began to twist the truth about his fate, publicly declaring his martyrdom and even publishing books in his name, greatly fueling interest, civil unrest, and demands for action against the government, revealing only Altman's data that would support their conclusion about the marker's divinity. So essentially they were cherry-picking information to push their own agenda, after murdering the man who they gathered the information from, all in service of the marker which they were directly exposed to. But anyway, since then Unitologists have worshipped the geophysicist as a martyr figure for their faith, and interpreted the black marker to be a sign from God, supported by the fragments of knowledge from Altman's notebook that were provided by his two, and I quote, acolytes, end quote. But ultimately Altman's body would come into possession of the church, and centuries later it had been stored in one of the many stasis capsules that would be sent into deep space aboard the massive ships of the church's mausoleum fleet. And with that is the history section covered. Now to give it a quick summary. Essentially, the published official history of the Church of Unitology is a lie perpetuated by the people who founded it. The founders in reality served the marker, killed the man who was researching it, and used that information to manipulate others into following the religion, all in service of the marker. Oh, and in addition to this, one section I missed, in the government's attempts to cover up Michael Altman's death, they would claim that his death was accidental and that he was no more than a hoaxer. But anyway, that's it for the history section. Now to talk about the marker, the main object of the faith's worship. In regards to its presence within Unitology, we've already gone over the origins of how they found this object and its significance to them. Unitologists believing the marker to be divine, but what's especially interesting about the marker as an entity is that there's two types. The black marker being the one that landed on Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs, and the man-made red markers. The black markers in particular originate from extraplanetary sources, probably travelling through space until they impact a planet. Meanwhile, the red markers are copies of the black one, typically built by intelligent civilizations as a means of producing energy. But despite the cosmetic differences, both types of marker are identical in function, receiving and rebroadcasting the same marker signal, albeit the red markers necessitate the death of their makers and subsequent absorption of their bodies to complete a convergence event. The actual shape and design of all markers is similar to the strands of a DNA helix, and ironically reflects the ultimate goal of unity after death, represented by the two spires twisting around each other upwards to become one. Also, a little bit of a side tangent here. I personally really like the marker's design, especially the glowing red ones. The overall design of the marker is just really sleek, and honestly, they would make a really cool desk lamp. Like, imagine this, it's 11, nearly 12 at night. Actually, what time is it? Oh, it's like 11:15. I did not notice it was getting that late. But yeah, anyway, imagine it's late at night, you're on your computer, you're preparing for a project, and you have one of these on your desk giving off just enough red light for you to see around the room. And it's a soft, gentle light too that's not going to agitate your eyes. And also, the light is red rather than blue, so it's not going to suppress the secretion of melatonin so you can sleep easier. Which, interestingly, is why most modern phones have an eye comfort shield setting, which can be used to mitigate the amount of blue light. But anyway, that's enough of the side tangent, back to the marker. Regarding the nature of the marker itself, the marker signal doesn't just reanimate the dead. It manipulates humanity on a psychological level. As we mentioned previously, people like Isaac Clarke could be given instructions to build more of them. while the less intelligent would become violent or mentally unstable, albeit the marker has negative effects even on people like Isaac Clarke, that being marker dementia, which causes a slew of schizophrenic and dementia-like symptoms. And by design, all markers emit this same concentrated energy, which affects both the dead and living. It's also theorized that the Brethren moons are the ultimate source of this signal, the master signal of the moons being received by the marker and distributed by them, which would make sense considering the markers are a key step in the convergence event to make a new moon. But interestingly enough, there's more to the marker signal than just reanimation and psychological manipulation. The marker signal is also capable of interfering with technology, such as communications equipment, and can manifest a powerful EMP blast whenever the marker goes through an extreme state change, although all markers contain the same properties no matter their form, albeit the intensity of the signal and its pulses appear to correlate with the size, and can even be strengthened or amplified by certain catalysts, such as the signal amplifying pedestal used for marker 3A, which was placed on Aegis 7 by EarthGov, after their experiments with the marker in an attempt to cover it up. And that's surprisingly enough all there is to say on the markers. Everything else that can be said has been said in my previous Dead Space videos, which I recommend you watch for further context, as the information in those videos is not necessary to this one but is there if you want it. The only exception to this being, when it comes to the actual churches of Unitology, the marker plays a heavy role in its design, and that's in a visual aspect due to its significance in the religion, such as the grandiose cathedrals signifying the church's status, which has marker-inspired pillars on both sides, or the usage of spears above the statues to represent the convergence. But ultimately much of the church's architecture is modelled after the black marker, the one that the religion was founded from, and a lot of the higher ranking Unitologists have clothing that sports the marker's symbols and shapes, again showing just how much these actually mean to the religion, which makes sense given they are the focal point of its entire theology. But ultimately with that covers the marker section of this video. I am actually going to take a break from recording this and come back to this tomorrow. And I am back, it is 11:40 AM. But yeah, with the group's history and their relevance to the marker covered, we can now further dive into the rest of Unitology. The first thing being, how does a religion like Unitology spread in the first place? Well, the church pushes a publicly positive and appealing message of social harmony and unity, given the make us whole thing, and builds a sense of community around the salvation it preaches, as well as the supposed environmentalist concerns as evident in some members' concern over the practice of planet cracking and its destabilization of the, and I quote, harmony of the universe, end quote, plus the apparent destructive course they believe EarthGov has taken. But despite this, the church has very close ties to the Concordance Extraction Corporation, the CEC, and are one of the company's major stakeholders, and Unitology appears to be very popular among CEC workers, this being evident from the amount of Unitologists we see in Dead Space Downfall, and the Unitology related stuff we see in Dead Space Remake, albeit most of Unitology's appeal stems from the actual setting of Dead Space. Spirituality and meaning have diminished in many people's lives, in the manner of a New Age movement, while Unitology provided a simple and holistic message of unity, harmony and fulfillment, in their world of increasingly industrial and demanding work, hence why it's popular among CEC workers. All of these factors, the grim conditions, the hope it provided and the message it held, made it grow rapidly, spreading all over human-controlled space. Also, a bit of a side note here. In regards to the planet cracking response, how some Unitologists are against it, this is likely a response from the Brethren Moon's influence, as a planet cracker could very easily kill a Brethren Moon. But it's also weirdly ironic that they would be against planet cracking when that's the very process that would discover the red marker, leading to the events on Aegis 7. But anyway, moving on, the next part of Unitology to talk about is the eschatology aspect. And for context, eschatology means expectations of the end of the present age, human history, or the world itself. Most noticeably, the end of the world or end times, which is a significantly important theme in several major religions today. In regards to Unitology, however, they see death and the end times as a positive thing, as in their faith, death is the gateway to convergence, through the power of the marker. As we said earlier, they believe that all living things will intertwine in the manner of two prongs of the marker to become one, which is the convergence event they are focused on. But interestingly enough, they believe that it will alleviate all the destructive materialistic problems of the human race. They also seem to believe that only Unitologists will be saved and non-believers will be forsaken unless their bodies come into possession of the church, some even referring to those who do not share this belief as infidels or heretics. They also believe that During convergence, human souls will cease to possess their individuality and all become intertwined as a single entity. Sometimes the word soul is substituted for body or flesh, however, in what is thought to be a figurative sense. Albeit, to summarise this, Unitology actively wants to see humanity die out and become a giant sky meatball, which makes sense given the mass suicides that follow every time a Necromorph outbreak begins, and how they like to leave their bodies intact for the convergence event, i.e. being reanimated as Necromorphs, which makes more sense when you look at the death rituals of the religion, as in Unitology, death is the most important step for a Unitologist, and they are encouraged to celebrate the deaths of loved ones and hope to join them in convergence rather than mourn. Unitologists refuse to allow their members' bodies to be buried or cremated, instead choosing to preserve them aboard ships or space stations. The reason for this is the belief that the human body must remain untouched after death, as this person's vessel is needed for convergence, i.e. them becoming a Brotherhood Moon or a Necromorph when the inevitable outbreak strikes. But anyway, they believe that if the human body's been kept intact and the Unitologist has lived an unselfish life, the bodies will be reborn with ascended spiritual and physical powers, and will live in unity with his or her other members as a single community. It's also heavily encouraged by members that they keep their bodies in the best shape possible upon death. Despite the supposedly peaceful exterior, the church is noted for having many cult-like features, including its indoctrination practices, its hierarchy, and its proven capacity to induce mass suicide. The teachings to embrace death further enhance this. In fact, speaking of the hierarchy, practices and such, we'll be moving on to them now. Firstly, regarding their public conduct, they are generally very evangelical in the way they go about things, preaching to non-Unitologists in an open manner. They're very open and unashamed of their beliefs, despite many of the public regarding their religion as bizarre or outright insane, and rightfully so, especially given the shit they do. But anyway, they publicly wear marker pendants they buy from the church. As a social statement, they are proud of their belief. Unitologists are also very devoted, spreading the word everywhere they go, usually through distributing literature in public spaces and propaganda posters. EarthGov even tried to suppress them on Titan Station by introducing a law that made it necessary for Unitologists to acquire a special permit before distributing literature. They rejected this policy and labelled it as oppression. EarthGov was also known to address evangelical Unitologists critically in the press, describing them as a threat to public order. Unitology also makes money through basically selling merchandise and memorabilia, usually through books, paperweights, miniature markers, stuff like that. But another way they make money is through the ranking system. Essentially, a Unitologist can pay a large sum of money to go up ranks in the church, which is something Isaac Clarke's mother did, which she blew all of his college money on, which is another reason Isaac Clarke rightfully despises them, especially with how Unitology affected his mother's mental health. But I'm gonna be honest, if you want to know more about Isaac Clarke's hatred of Unitology, go watch the video on him. Anyway, now to continue talking about the practices of Unitology. The first of concern would actually be the indoctrination process. When Unitology members join, they initiate through a process known as indoctrination, and the church does not favour individuals who are strong-willed and critical-minded, usually assessing them to determine whenever they can be allowed in deeper or not. There's also a great deal of secrecy surrounding this process, so what it is exactly we don't know. But if I had to guess on what it is, it'd probably be some form of psychological assessment, specifically one that's been made to gaslight and manipulate and groom the new member into joining the group. So to basically summarise that, the church doesn't like people who can see through their bullshit, and we use a psychological process of some kind to assess if that's the kind of person they're dealing with. Next up we have prayer. It appears they engage in communal prayer led by the church's ranked clergy, evident from the sermons twice weekly posters you can find around in Dead Space Remake. Then there is meditation. They're known to meditate with their arms locked in a cross manner similar to the appearance of the marker, having a number of aids for this process including marker replicas, candles and mats. This meditation is characterized as quiet, reverent as they focus their minds on the teachings of the church. And then there was the aforementioned death ritual which we went over earlier. And with those, now to go over the aforementioned hierarchy and ranking system. Unitology is a multi-tiered religion, the church requiring members to contribute large sums of money in order to move up in ranks within it. The lowest rank is called Initiative, forming a bulk of its believers. Above them are the vested members who have purchased full membership into the church, and leading the initiatives invested are the Overseers, a type of high priest. Another high rank is that of the Paragon, who is responsible for enacting judgment on members who step out of line. And finally, at the very top of the tree are the Enigmas, masked individuals who lead the Church of Unitology and which includes its founders. The church is said to possess considerable political and economic influence. Well, said to, they definitely do, despite a persistent atmosphere of what they see as persecution by EarthGov. The upper ranks of the CEC are mentioned as being increasingly controlled by Unitologists, Warren Eckert being the most notable example. For context as to what happened with Warren Eckert, he was an executive director of colonial mining operations for the CEC, and was secretly a member of the Church of Unitology, responsible for seeding believers throughout the USG Ishimura prior to its mission to Aegis 7. Meaning Warren Eckert went out of his way to infiltrate as much of the USG Ishimura with Unitologists as he could. He was also the main antagonist of Dead Space Extraction, and his actions were so noticeable that First Officer D. White is quoted as saying, "Eckert screwed us good, didn't he? If a CEC director could go that bad, maybe the whole company's rotten to the core, just like Aegis 7. All of this showing just how much influence the Church of Unitology actually has. If just one of them could get into a position of infiltration on this level, you could already imagine what they did to EarthGov, which is likely how they overthrew EarthGov in Dead Space 3. Actually, the more I think about it, it's very likely that Unitology completely infiltrated EarthGov from within, leading to their complete downfall in Dead Space 3. But anyway, in summary, Unitology don't just make money off selling merchandise, they make money off exploiting their members. Devout members paying money to go up in ranks. And despite what the group claims, they are very much able to influence people politically and economically, even able to infiltrate large companies and spread their agenda unseen, only growing their power with each infiltration. Also, throughout all of this, you may have noticed Unitology has a tendency to be quite exploitive, not just that, but saying one thing and doing another. The whole, "oh, we don't like planet cracking," while they proceed to infiltrate and take control of a whole planet cracking operation. The whole, "oh, as part of Unitology, you have to reject your material goods and accept death," while they simultaneously exploit their members for financial gain. And they go out of the way to actively preserve themselves to convert as many people as possible, and they try to convert as many people by whatever means necessary, which makes sense when you consider the whole religion was built on the cherry picking of information by two manipulative murderers, who did it all in service of the marker. Yeah, Unitology being very two-faced and hypocritical is a massive reoccurring thing you're going to notice throughout this. But anyway, now to talk about the deeper secrets of the church. First being their faith in the marker and their scientific credibility. While this is something we partially touched on at the beginning with the true origins of Unitology, there's a bit more to it. While Unitology prides itself on being an apparent and I quote rational and scientific religion end quote, the church is entirely convinced the government has been hiding or experimenting on the marker since its discovery, the outright animosity and conflict between the two persisting to the 26th century, with Unitologists still adamantly believing that the marker was being hidden by the government, and that Altman was the founder despite the actual truth being what we went over earlier. But by 2508, a leading scientist in Unitology, Dr. Terence Kyne, formulated theories on the black marker and human evolution based on notes from Altman's work on the project, the church secretly financing and completing several studies on the biodiversity of the region in which the marker was found, with the influence of the black marker in mind. And despite interference from EarthGov, they did some tests on aquatic life from near the crater region, in which the church was able to confirm variations from standard genotypes in the specimens, which added further proof to their faith in the marker's signal and its ability to influence organic life, followed by another study on human brain tissue from the region, which led them to believe that humans were uniquely reactive, in quotations, to marker influence and supported their theory that the artifact had an effect on the development of proto-human life. Albeit they didn't know the real reason the marker was doing this, and that real reason was to push humanity towards growing and developing and becoming a species that would be advanced enough to necessitate the use of energy. As we see what happened with the Tolvalantians, they were pushed down the same path, became dependent on energy, ran into an energy crisis, discovered the markers and likely tried to use the markers to generate energy as well. The Tolvalantians would then propagate the markers, leading to their eventual fate, albeit that's better covered in the Brethren Moon video. But anyway, essentially, Unitology tried to study the marker to prove their beliefs, and while they got information they believed backed their beliefs, the truth was this was only surface level. In reality, the marker had far more malicious intentions that they could never realise, and they saw just enough to reinforce their beliefs, not seeing the full picture. Next up we have soul cleansing. Many critics say that the church is closer to a ruthless cult, and with good fucking reason. unafraid to use force to protect its secrets. Believers are expected to donate not only their wealth and possessions, but even their bodies after death. Followers and worshippers who step out of line or question Unitology's teachings are forced to undergo a process known as soul cleansing, which is mandated for members who wish to enter the church's higher ranks. All we know about this soul cleansing process is that it's extremely psychologically damaging and can result in headaches and nausea for some time afterwards. As to specifics of what this process is, we do not know, but I have a few theories. Albeit before I explain them, it's very clear that there is some sort of biological or physiological process that's involved, evident from the headaches and nausea. But anyway, now to give my theories. My first theory is that it's a form of psychological conditioning, which could be carried out through the use of various psychoactive drugs, hypnotic suggestion, and other means of influencing the person's sense of individuality. The negative effects from the exposure of these drugs possibly being the headaches and nausea, and the psychological damage being from the trauma of the process. A second theory I have is that they're using a modified version of the eye-poking machine from Dead Space 2 to forcefully alter the thinking patterns of the person to make them less critical of Unitology. Or thirdly, they use a form of brain surgery to alter the personality of the subject, which would most likely involve altering the frontal lobe, or possibly even using the marker signal directly exposed to the brain to force behavioural changes. Also, when you consider the resources available to the Church of Unitology, all three theories could be possible. But unfortunately, we can't say anything for certain as we have no real information. But anyway, next we have mausoleum fleets. The church secretly funded the construction of these mausoleum ships, massive vessels carrying stasis storage tubes to transport the bodies of its members, although there's no documented evidence of this shipbuilding program ever being supplied to the public. The rumours of its existence refuse to die, however, with witnesses claiming to have seen the fleet and described its huge size of these vessels, albeit in reality the purpose of this fleet was to transport the bodies of the church's members beyond the reach of its enemies, the ships being sent towards uncharted space in the hopes that the Brethren would make the bodies whole. Notice the use of the Brethren and whole. It's very clear that the highest ranks of the church possibly have knowledge of the Brethren moon's existence, and the biomass of the bodies is being sent out to lure them towards Earth. In fact, personally, I believe the highest ranks of the Unitologists are fully aware of the Brethren moon's existence, especially given the Circle's behaviour in Dead Space 3. They are fully aware of the Brethren moons and actively want to push for convergence in spite of them knowing what will happen. But anyway, the ships were designed for centuries of deep space operation, and were equipped with highly advanced defense technology which could be useless if the marker signal converts the corpses inside into necromorphs. However, disclosing any information pertaining to these fleets to, and I quote, heretical parties, end quote, is punishable by seizing of property or excommunication from the church, which shows that these corpse fleets mean a lot to the church's higher ranks. Which, when you consider the use of Brethren and Whole, it's very clear that the higher ranks know exactly what's going on. Next we have the USG Ishimura and its infiltration by the church. Using their heavy influence within the CEC, the owners of the USG Ishimura replaced much of the ship's crew with Unitologists as we mentioned before, and they were sent on their fateful mission to Aegis 7 with the goal of securing Marker 3A. These replacements happening after the discovery of Marker 3A on Aegis 7. News of the discovery reached the church, leading to Warren Eckerd and his infiltration and him bringing in all the Unitologists. However, there's more to it. Eckerd was also entrusted by Enigma Lange with a covert mission to infiltrate the colony itself and find someone who showed signs of being immune to the Marker's disturbing effects. The immune person also being able to protect those around them from the Marker's effects. That person in question being Lexine Murdoch, a 20-year-old surveyor, albeit Eckerd's plan to capture her would fail, after he was attacked from behind by a leaper and mauled to death, and Lexine would make her escape by boarding a shuttle and setting course for the Sprawl, the space station that serves as the setting for Dead Space 2. But as to why he was sought after her, this is because of him hearing about the reports of the colonists suffering marker dementia and its link to the marker, though Enigma sent Warren to go find her as a way to potentially solve the situation. But interesting enough, it wasn't so that she could protect the people on the ship who were suffering, it's so she could be taken to the church and used to protect those there. So the goal wasn't even to save those who were suffering from the marker dementia, it was to stop the actual religion's leaders themselves being affected by it, which shows that they are callous and only care about their own self-preservation, which is again antithetical to the whole embracing death thing, which they continuously preach about, showing just how hypocritical Unitology's leaders are. Also, interesting enough, Chief Science Officer Terence Kyne was the church's expert on the marker aboard the Ishimura. During his observations, he noted that the infection did not correspond with the teachings of Unitology, and he believed that what he was witnessing was unethical. He had repeatedly stirred that the church was mistaken and attempted to stop Captain Matthias's mission. However, Dr. Chalice Mercer would exist as a complete contrast to this. He had gone to create the Hunter in his desire to further the infection. Mercer believed that he had a missionary duty to help Marker 3A trigger convergence, and that this would specifically grant him eternal life, showing that Dr. Chalice Mercer created the Hunter and was willing to let it kill other people out of a selfish desire to preserve himself. Also, if we look at Terence Kyne and Dr. Chalice Mercer, both are examples of how people would react to a Necromorph outbreak. Terence Kyne turned away from it, realizing this was not what they were promised, and Dr. Chalice Mercer actively embraced it. In fact, Dr. Chalice Mercer is a good example of the path it usually takes, evident with the Circle, and how Unitologists have a tendency to double down rather than back out. But anyway, with that, now to move on to the next part, the sabotaging of Titan Station. Following the creation of the Site-12 marker by EarthGov on Titan Station, word of the secret project reached the Church of Unitology, who sought to release the marker from EarthGov control and bring about convergence, in which the Unitologists sabotaged the project and deliberately unleashed the Necromorph outbreak, Diana Lee Gwynn leading the operation on behalf of the Church. In addition to this, Carrie Norton, an inductee, was manipulated into completing a special secret mission for the Church on the Titan mines, leading to her unleashing the Necromorph outbreak, the more casual members of the Church on the Sprawl being informed that their rebirth was coming, found in the form of a text log, in which a woman was talking about a unique ceremony they were preparing for. However, the aforementioned Carrie Norton willingly chose to combat the Necromorphs when she realized she had condemned civilians to their deaths, after realizing she had been betrayed by her fellow Unitologist Tyler Radikov, and then goes on to renounce her faith after realizing the Church's true intentions, then shifts to working with the EarthGov director Hans Tiedemann, as to work towards stopping the Necromorph infection from spreading. Meanwhile, Diana would use the chaos to secure Isaac Clarke, as to use him as a means of creating more markers for the Church, in their goal to, and I quote, spread glorious convergence to the entire galaxy, end quote. Which shows the Church of Unitology is not only fully aware of the Necromorphs, they are fully aware of the marker's ability to create them. At least they're only aware of this in the higher ranks. I don't imagine the average Unitologist who is new to it is going to know about this, evident from Norton's reaction, but ultimately it shows those at the very top are aware. But anyway, with that, next on this list we have the Circle, the most extreme branch of Unitologists throughout the franchise, showing that yet again, rather than back out, they'll just double down. As after the incident on Titan Station in 2511, many Unitologists doubled their efforts to spread the gospel of their religion, taking up arms and fighting against EarthGov as well, the most prominent of these groups being the Circle, who were a particularly violent and fanatical group, led by Jacob Arthur Danick. They used their substantial financial gain and political connections of the Church to commit acts of terrorism, wherever a red marker test lab may be located on any given colony. The Circle was absolutely dedicated to bringing humanity to convergence through force, Danick even believing that the creation of the marker replicas based on the original black marker was an intrinsic aspect of the human race, but they needed to do so with respect and care for the markers and the, and I quote, natural evolution of the universe, end quote. Danick also saw EarthGov's test labs and experiments on their own captive marker copies as perversions of nature, and sought to free the red markers in an effort to undo the damage he believed the government had done, viewing the Necromorphs as a consequence of EarthGov's tampering. However, in contrast to the average follower of Unitology, who were natural church-going types, members of the Circle had some level of combat training beforehand, which combined with their religious fanaticism and their large fleet of dropships, allowed them to overwhelm EarthGov's forces at the marker test sites. Which personally, I'm gonna say makes no sense. These guys have some level of military training, yes, but they're not an organized military, unlike the giant organized military EarthGov had. What I'm saying is EarthGov is not going to be beaten by Unitologists in a one-on-one war. The only way this would make sense is if EarthGov was completely infiltrated from within, and a combination of internal sabotage, internal betrayal and backstabbery allowed them to weaken EarthGov from within and then storm it and destroy what was left. Or what would make more sense is for them to infiltrate a marker containment facility, cause a Necromorph outbreak and use that to completely decimate the place, and then proceed to mop up any survivors that are left, which would make sense considering they viewed the Necromorphs as a consequence of EarthGov's tampering. So letting the supposed natural consequences of their actions happen would be a more fitting and thematic way of doing it, which would also tie it all together in a natural way fitting the narrative. Like, we know Unitologists have infiltrated and caused outbreaks before, so of course they could learn to weaponize this, especially if they believe it to be a natural consequence of their enemy's wrongdoing. But anyway, while some members had their doubts after witnessing the horrors of the Necromorphs, they were reassured by their superiors that they were doing the right thing because this would push it all towards convergence. Again, that whole make us whole thing that they're always yammering on about. And with that, that's the circle. Now to quickly summarize them. Essentially, absolute marker fanatics somehow managed to overthrow the government of Earth, and go out of their way to blow up marker testing facilities so they can set them free to trigger convergence. And with that, now we can move on to the Terra Nova cult, the final notable aspect of Unitology. After the destruction of the Brethren moon on Tol Volantis after the events of Dead Space 3 leading into its DLC, which I'm going to go out on a limb and say I do not believe to be canon because of how it compromises the ending, but I said that in a previous video, whatever, moving on. After the moon's destruction, the cult was left in very little numbers, but even then their faith in Unitology grew to become even more extreme as they formed a new cult aboard the derelict CMS Terra Nova. They mutilated their bodies and severed their hands, replacing them with crude mechanical parts to make themselves more like the Necromorphs. They viewed the Brethren moons as gods and the Circle's leader, Jacob Danik, who was killed when the Tol Volantis moon awoke, as their saint. This new cult in particular being led by an anonymous leader and self-proclaimed prophet, who during a ritual would cut off the hands of those willing or not, in complete contrast to the usual teachings that their body was a sacred vessel that had to be preserved for convergence. This new cult leader began preaching that the body is imperfect, cutting away the body's imperfections and replacing them with these grotesque appendages in honour of the Brethren moons, claiming that this way they could be made whole, which caused several of the former members of the Circle to refuse to join the new church, some such as Randall Carr even outright losing their faith in Unitology. The cult, however, was completely destroyed after Isaac Clarke and John Carver killed the leader, and the Brethren moons abandoned them, seeing they had no further purpose to serve. And with that, to summarise, the CMS Terra Nova cult, extreme Unitologist fanatics who mutilated their bodies to be like the Necromorphs, as another example of them doubling down rather than backing out, barring the few exceptions. And unlike all the previous branches, these ones outright serve the moons, giving us confirmation that at least some of them know. Then said cult gets absolutely wiped out and abandoned because they became useless to the very being they worshipped. Another thing to note about them is the blatant hypocrisy. As I mentioned, Unitology's desire to preserve the body, and yet these guys are completely hacking it up to cut away any imperfection, showing that yet again they double down on the double standards. And with that, we've covered the secrets of the church and its degeneration throughout the series. Well, I say degeneration, that's what it looked like on the surface, but when you actually consider what created Unitology and the driving forces behind it, it's more or less the facade being ripped away. Speaking of the facade and how it presents itself, this next section is going to be the actual inspiration for Unitology from a writing standpoint and its ties into real-world religion. Getting straight into that, the first most obvious inspiration would be Scientology, art director Ian Milham citing it as one of the inspirations. In particular, the grounds that members had to pay vast amounts of money to earn the church's teachings and secrets. However, many other developers deny that Unitology is directly inspired by Scientology or a direct criticism of it, stating that Unitology is intended as a pastiche of cult organizations in general. Albeit this response may or may not be related to the Church of Scientology's reputation for filing lawsuits over negative portrayals, which interestingly enough, South Park actually did a whole joke about this during their episode related to Scientology. In the episode Trapped in the Closet, the 12th episode of the 9th season, in which the episode ends with Stan looking directly at the camera and shouting, and I quote, "Okay, good, do it, I'm not scared of you, sue me," end quote. Only for the closing credits to name only John Smith and Jane Smith, which is in reference to Cruz and the Church of Scientology's reputation for litigiousness. Secondly, I do believe Christianity and Islam and other religious faiths around them may have played an inspiration little bits here and there. Christianity playing an inspiration in how the religion presents itself for its propaganda posters and how it conducts itself. Also in the themes of what it presents with the whole unity, heaven and all that. Also, before we continue, it's very clear that the negative stereotypes of religions play a role in this as well. The violent religious fanaticism and the fact that they use the word infidel, clearly inspired by radical Islam, makes that pretty clear. And interestingly enough, H.P. Lovecraft's work definitely played an inspiration as well, both in the eldritch themes of the Brethren Moons, which is further explored in that video, and a bit of the architecture of the churches themselves. And with that, that's all the obvious inspirations that I can point out. I have a feeling there may be a few more scattered here and there, but I can't exactly find them. Nothing else particularly stands out as being very obvious, but ultimately with that I want to give my thoughts on Unitology as a whole before we bring the video to an end. I say, Unitology is very obviously a death cult, one that abuses its members and enacts the highest degree of hypocrisy and irony possible. They demand one shed all possessions only to demand cash from them. They ask for the body only for their leaders to actively take all means to preserve themselves. They wish to bring unity when all they inevitably bring is chaos and death. All founded by a manipulative pair of murderers in service to something unknowable, uncaring and evil that sees all life as a mere crop to be sown and reaped as it says so. At its core, I say Unitology as an idea is simply evil. Even if the average member desires peace, the faith itself is caustic and insidious, an ideological ticking time bomb that only grows worse with time. They will inevitably find a marker, and when they do, all hell will break loose. Simply put, Unitology is a hypocritical cult of extinction, driven by a primordial, ever-hungering evil. And yes, while certainly standout good ones exist, such as the large Native American fellow from Dead Space Downfall, and the one who assists you in Dead Space Remake, and the average Unitologist probably does not wish harm on anyone, it's the ideology itself that's evil, evident from the likes of Danik and its higher ranks. And with that, I conclude my thoughts on Unitology. Which actually brings us towards the end of the video, but before you leave, I would like to remind you to please like, subscribe and comment, as it would help my channel out immensely. And with that, that brings us to the conclusion of the video. Good day, good night, goodbye, I will enjoy seeing you around next time.